All right. Well, welcome everyone to our first online session of the Agroecology Evening School. I'm happy to see you guys who are here live, and for anybody who's listening on YouTube, welcome. I hope you enjoy what we have to talk about today. We're going to cover a number of things over the course of this little talk. It was like that little. Probably tried to pack too much in here. I had originally tried to have even more and then realized there was just no way I could get through all of the material in like less than an hour. So really, I just kind of want to do two things. One, briefly introduce the idea of agroecology, what agroecology means, what it's meant for other people, and what I kind of see it as meaning and doing, and why I think it's important and useful. And then I want to kind of dive into a sort of a history of agroecology to kind of help to understand where this field comes from and where some of these ideas originate. And to do that, I'm going to go pretty far back, all the way back to the 6th century AD, and arguably before that, and give you a very concrete example of, if you will, kind of the foundations of agroecology. We're going to focus primarily on Latin America and specifically Mexico and Central America, so Mesoamerica. And as you'll see, there's a good reason for doing this. Agroecology as a field really emerges in Central America first, and then is kind of taken to other parts of the world and articulated elsewhere. But we're going to see through this history, starting in the 6th century and going forward, there's a really good reason for why this happened, and why this field of knowledge and practice in politics emerged where it did. Oops. So, first of all, just kind of briefly, because this is something that we'll be kind of figuring out over the extent of this course, this fall, winter, and spring. This question of what is agroecology and why is it a useful term? I think probably everybody who's here and probably listening to this, y'all are aware of terminology and ideas of what we might call alternative agriculture. So here in North America, we're used to concepts like permaculture, regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, sustainable agriculture. There's a lot of different terms. And I think many of us, we probably used or identified with some of these different things that, for different reasons, different times. Agroecology encompasses a lot of those ideas of alternative agriculture. But I would say that the difference between agroecology as a terminology and a field of study and some of these others is that it's very expansive. And this, I think this quote gets at it pretty well. That agroecology is a platform for research, practice, and political action. And that it combines all of these things, that it's not merely a kind of technical platform, so kind of like agronomy, that it's not just something that people do kind of individually or maybe as an organization. And it's not just a political action platform, but instead it combines all of these things into really kind of an ethos or a worldview, you might even say. And it's rooted, as the quote goes on to say, in small scale or peasant agriculture. And it was born out of a critique of industrial capitalist agriculture. So we're going to see in today's talk really kind of two major components in terms of the history. One, traditional forms of agriculture, particularly as they developed in the Americas. And two, the emergence of industrial agriculture and the way that it sort of was introduced to Latin America and the resistance to it. The other thing about agroecology, and if we continue, is that it combines a bunch of different elements. So it does include traditional knowledge and kind of looking back to past practices, but it doesn't just take those as kind of the only possibilities. It actively incorporates science. So it does not reject modern science, modern scientific methods, research institutions, things like this. What it does is it points out that science by itself is not strictly neutral, that the way that science is employed, the kind of political settings, the goals to which it is directed, all of these things shape science itself and the results and the sort of processes that come about. Agroecology says that we should take modern science, but we should apply it within certain contexts, and that it shouldn't kind of stand by itself, that it should consciously be a part of these other things. Now, in reality, science is always a part of some kind of political mechanism or larger project. Just historically, scientists have not always recognized this. There's often been a resistance to kind of recognizing that, this idea that science is purely neutral or independent. We know this isn't the case. Science has to make political and ethical commitments just like everything else. And so we have science, we have traditional knowledge, we have nature and kind of the experience of nature, and then we have political action. So all of these things are kind of integrated into one whole, and that can be applied in lots of different settings and in lots of different kind of contexts. So it's applicable in Latin America, in the global South, but there are also ways that we can draw upon agroecology here in North America, here in the United States. And that'll be something that we want to really get at as we go through this course, is as we look at examples from other parts of the world, as we examine this history, and as we look at the kind of the science and the practical applications, what can we do with them in our circumstances here in the 21st century United States, and specifically here in Chattanooga in the year 2025. All right. So to better understand what agroecology is and where it comes from, we're gonna go pretty far back. We're gonna go all the way back to not the origins of agriculture in the Americas, but to a specific site in ancient Mesoamerica. And there are a couple of reasons I wanted to do this. One is, as we'll see, agroecology as a field really emerges in Central America. That's where it's articulated, really from the 1980s forward. So this background is important because the practices, the knowledge, the political forms that people in ancient Mesoamerica developed, many of these would survive, and they would inform the formation of agroecology in the 20th century. The Americas are also important, I think, because more than Afro-Eurasia, more than the old world, the types of agriculture that are developed in the Americas are just generally more in line with agroecological principles of what we would now, I think, or what we might call sustainable agriculture. And for those of you who have heard me talk about the history of agriculture before, you might be able to guess at why this is. One of the big reasons is that unlike Eurasia, you never really get much domestication in the Americas of animals. So you get a little bit here and there. In this, for example, in Joya de Cerén in what's now El Salvador, there would have been probably turkeys and dogs. That's probably it. Maybe white-tailed deer, although that's unlikely. You don't have cows, you don't have goats, you don't have sheep, you don't have horses. And this is really crucial, right? If you think about agriculture in Eurasia, after a certain point, actually probably really early on, field rotations are a big thing, right? You can use manure from your domesticated animals to revitalize your fields. This is a big deal. You don't have that in the Americas. A couple other things too that I think people often kind of miss out on. One of them is that because in the Americas you don't really have big domestic animals for eating, right? If you want meat, you only have a couple of options. There are a few kind of small domesticates like dogs and turkeys, and maybe white-tailed deer, and maybe a couple others. But for pretty much all peoples in the Americas, if you want meat, you have to hunt it. And so even among the Mexica and the Maya, like highly urbanized societies, hunting of wild game remains pretty important. So this means that people who are living in agricultural societies kind of keep one foot in the wild because they have to. If you want meat, you have to go and hunt it. Whereas in the old world, in Afro-Eurasia, for many, many people, that's just not an option. Hunting, it survives, but it becomes more and more of a kind of rarefied and upper class thing, right? The average person, if he or she is getting meat, is from domesticated animals. And if you're a herder out in the desert with domesticated animals, your relationship to nature is going to be pretty different than if you're a hunter who also does maybe a little bit of gathering. So this is going to be, I think, really crucial. And we might come back to this at some point this year. The third thing that's really important is there are no horses in the Americas, right? They go extinct at the end of the Ice Age. So polities in the Americas, even the really big ones like the Maya city-states or the Mexica Empire, their ability to project power is always pretty limited. Waterways give you, some possibilities, but if you don't have horses, you cannot build a huge continental empire like, say, the Mongols or any other Eurasian empire. You just can't do it. The closest anyone in the Americas gets before the Spanish are the Inca, who do have semi-domesticated animals that let them travel pretty long distances. But nobody else is able to do this. This means that once you get a certain distance from any center of power in the Americas, the ability of elite to kind of control people it diminishes. And as we'll see in Joya de Cerén, I think this is really important and it's often underrated. All right. Well, so the reason I picked this site, which I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this, I wouldn't say it's super well known. It ought to be more well known than it is. But this is a village site in southern El Salvador. It dates to the 6th century, so it is quite old. And the reason it's important is that the village of Joya de Cerén had the kind of misfortune of being right next to a volcano. As in, like, the volcano is, I think, 500 meters north of the village. Of course, they didn't know it was there when they built the village. But the volcano erupted in, I want to say, 536, although don't quote me on that. Might be thinking of something else. Sometime in the 6th century. And while it was kind of slow enough that it seems everybody in the village got out on time, it was fast enough that everything in the village, other than the people, was completely covered in hot ash. So we're all familiar with the example of Pompeii. This is kind of a smaller scale version of Pompeii, in which it seems nobody died. So the volcano only covered a relatively small area, but what it did cover, as you can see, this is mostly ash. It did a really good job of covering. So it's actually this layer right here, and then these were later eruptions. So what happened, just like at Pompeii, is almost perfect preservation. Preservation that is extremely rare in any setting, but in the tropics is super rare, right? A lot of stuff just doesn't last very long in the tropics because it's, the tropics. For our purposes, the most amazing preservation that you get is the agricultural system at Joya de Cerén. And so in this image on the left, you can see these are the kind of in-field milpa, where you would have had a bunch of different things growing, where you can see the ridges that the villagers made. And then these are the various structures. So some of these are residential houses. There's a bunch of different ones. And I'll put the relevant literature in the show notes of the YouTube video for anybody who's interested. Beyond the little village, and we'll talk a bit more about what was around the houses, are the outfields. Not only were the rows preserved, so you can see the contours here, but because the ash fell so quickly, it actually created molds of the plants that were out in the field. So these, the little round thingies, inside of those are hollow spaces in the shape of the plants that the villagers had cultivated. Unfortunately for them, this season was like a total loss. But fortunately for us, basically everything was preserved. Well, almost everything. And what the archaeologists did is they basically injected these molds with plaster, which then created models of what were in them. Along with these casts, archaeologists have done flotation recovery and been able to identify, goodness, dozens, if not hundreds of species of trees and plants that the people of Joya de Cerén were using or cultivating or at least tolerating in some way. We also have really good evidence of the food that was being stored in the village itself, so like in the houses. So what we got out of this, I'll skip ahead to the next, so you can kind of see a map of the village to get a better idea of the layout. What we get from Joya de Cerén is this just beautiful snapshot of as far as we know, is a pretty typical Mayan village of the 6th century. It just had the bad luck of being next to a volcano that perfectly preserved almost everything. There are a few things that were not preserved, but pretty much everything else is there. And what it reveals is really incredible, and is something I think pretty different than if you read a lot of other archaeology of the Maya, particularly from this period. I'm just going to focus on the agricultural aspect, but really kind of everything about it is just absolutely fascinating. Some of the things that we see that are relevant to us in thinking about agroecology. One is that agriculture, cultivation took place all over the village. So as you can see from the map, in the areas that have been excavated, and of course there's a lot that hasn't been because it's under several feet of, not several, like a dozen feet or more of ashfall. We see that there were gardens surrounding these structures. So as you left your house or kitchen or other things, there would have been what the archaeologists have called kitchen gardens immediately adjacent to these houses. And these kitchen gardens would have been incredibly diverse in terms of what grew there. I cannot tell you all the different things because they're totally unfamiliar to me because I don't live in El Salvador. But it would have been a mix of annual crops, of perennial herbaceous stuff, and lots of trees. So fruit trees, nut trees, stuff with kind of medicinal and other purposes. So something similar to kind of almost a forest garden. So in the immediate vicinity of the houses. They also had very close by to their homes, milpa. So some of y'all might be familiar with this term. Milpa, of course, they're still around. You can see them here in Chattanooga. Maya migrants from Central America have brought them here. And the basic idea of the milpa, of course, is you have corn, maize as the primary crop, usually, that's interplanted with beans, squash, and really anything else. One of the things that we learned from Joya de Cerén is that their milpa, I mean, it had corn, so corn was really important, but it also had cassava, which has another name in Latin America, and I can't think what it is. Mayanak. This stuff down here. corn we knew about. Like this was known to be a staple of Mayan agriculture. That the tubers were much less known because they just don't preserve very well. Corn lasts pretty well in archaeological context, but a lot of these other plants that have been found at Joya de Cerén were not known from other archaeological contexts. These were largely new. So one of the things that it revealed is that the milpas were themselves extremely diverse just in terms of their main crops. Beyond, so you had the kitchen gardens and the milpas adjacent to houses, and then since this map was made, go back here, these kind of outfield milpas have also been excavated and explored. And we know that not only do they have your main crops, but they also had a lot of things that we might call weeds, but probably had, almost certainly had other purposes. So in modern Central America, these are known as quilite, which I believe is from a Nahuatl word. And some of these might be familiar. So this, y'all recognize, I think all but this one. I don't remember what this plant is, but this is goosefoot, amaranth, and purslane are these three. So within the milpas, you would have had a huge diversity of annual plants, some of which were probably just tolerated, some of which might very well have been cultivated. There were also trees within the milpas, so not every tree would have been cleared. We also know that these kitchen gardens and milpas, they were sustained for pretty long periods of time. And so there seems to have been some kind of method of either fertilization, of field rotation, probably similar to what people in more modern times do, although we don't know for sure, obviously. The sum effect of all of this was a remarkable prosperity in terms of food production and also just in terms of stuff. Uh, these households, which don't seem to be exceptional in terms of size or in any other way, had a great deal of pottery, of trade items, of obsidian, of things that people were clearly trading in the nearby marketplace for, using the stuff that they produced in their households. We also have a pretty good sense of how much corn these folks were producing because their corn for the year was buried in ash. And what's really remarkable is that each household at Joya de Cerén, I don't remember the exact numbers, but their amount of corn was about equivalent to what kind of the lower end of modern industrial agricultural corn production. So corn production using modern methods of fertilizer and pesticides and things like that. It's really impressive for a pre-modern society. But not only do they have all of these different, have a large amount of corn and other staple crops, this is a very diverse polyculture. So nutritionally, this would have been a very productive and rich environment. And even beyond that, they're not just growing things, sort of functional. They're also growing and using a good bit of cacao. So making chocolate, basically, which prior to this site, we tended to think of as mainly an elite thing. But we know that in the case of Joya de Cerén, that kind of regular people are growing cacao and making use of it. This is not restricted to the elite. Let me stop there. Oh goodness, I could go on about this site, but a couple of takeaways from it. One is we see what we can think of as kind of agroecological principles already in use in the 6th century. These kitchen gardens, fields, forest gardens that these villagers are cultivating are very much polycultures. So there is no monoculture of any sort going on here. Every piece of agricultural land has multiple species. Some of those species are cultivars. Some of them are probably semi-cultivated, and others are pretty clearly wild plants that are either too much trouble to weed out or perhaps actively tolerated. Now, we don't know, how these villagers kind of thought about their agriculture, right? Are they consciously leaving particular plants, encouraging things the way we might today for pollinators and beneficial insects? Did they have this knowledge kind of actively or theoretically? That we don't know. But in terms of practice, they're kind of doing the work, right? They have figured out these methods and they're making them work for them quite well, other than the volcano, which they couldn't control. We also know that there is a political component to this. So the kitchen gardens and the milpa immediately adjacent to people's houses seem to have been kind of owned or managed by individual families, but it is likely that the outfields would have been more communal. And so there seems to be there's kind of sharing aspects, but then there's also probably some kind of market or bartering. Some of the households clearly specialized in certain things. So some specialized in plants for textile production, right? For example, or some might have specialized in cacao. But the products of that agriculture are kind of equally distributed across this village. There are no most of the households are more or less equal. There's no sharp gradient of rich or poor within this village. And what we can reconstruct of the political structure, so there was a kind of a common house. It was probably the kind of council house. It also seems to be very much village oriented. There's very little indication of, if you will, elite interference. The closest kind of city-state center it's not that far away, but it seems to be far away enough. So while these people might have been paying taxes of some sort, it's not a particularly heavy burden. So you have a very prosperous village that has this rich and complex polyculture that is producing enough to sustain them and also for them to trade to other villages and other people. So now, obviously, this is one snapshot, and this is from like the 6th century. It can't stand in for every place in time, but as far as we know, it's pretty typical of Mesoamerican agriculture before the Spanish arrive. Because I'm running longer than I meant to, I'm just going to skip over this briefly. um, if we look north to our own continent, just about anywhere that we look within agricultural societies, we can see really similar things. And this might be something that we come back to later on in this course. But there are similar polycultures, we might say proto-agroecological systems all across North America. Here in North America, the conditions aren't really as nice as in Mesoamerica, where you have basically an indefinite growing season. But even in places with really difficult growing conditions, so the American Southwest is a great example, you see from very early on the emergence of these really complex and sophisticated, if you will, proto-agroecological systems, where people are cultivating these complex polycultures using lots of different methods. And they're methods that pay very close attention to the land and to existing ecologies. Yeah, I won't go into those anymore. We'll come back to these another time. All right. So we have Joya de Cerén kind of standing in for traditional polyculture-based agriculture in Latin America. Obviously, there's a lot of variation depending on where you are, particular people groups, but I think it's a pretty good example. Of course, this all begins to change in 1492 when the Spanish, or better, the Iberians arrive and begin the conquest of what will become Latin America, of New Spain. Now, of course, this is a huge history, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of things that are relevant to the formation of agroecology. One of the big differences between Central and South America and North America is there are just a lot more people there when the Spanish arrive. And while a lot of people will die in the first century, thanks to disease and other things, After the 17th century, there is a population recovery. And this applies across pretty much everywhere. Indigenous populations, they bottom out, it's the early 1600s, but then they start to kind of climb back, and probably get back close to where they were, prior to Columbus. So this is really important. Um, this means that the Spanish and then later Creoles and others, they never have kind of total control over Mexico or Central America or other places, in the way that will eventually be true in North America. I mean, it'll take a long time here too. Indigenous people and indigenous systems of agriculture survive in a lot more places and a lot more robustly than will really be the case here in what will become the United States. Now, the Spanish and then later independent states in Latin America introduce a lot of changes, obviously. So the Spanish will subdivide a lot of the lands that they rule into encomiendas, where native peoples are forced to either, to work directly or to, adopt certain practices to support the encomenderos. And you'll get, starting early on and continuing really up to the present, this kind of back and forth dynamic in which the Spanish and then later colonial elite will consolidate land, but they never quite accomplish like full consolidation. And then you also get pushback. So this is the other thing that I think separates Latin America from North America. You get pretty big and oftentimes pretty successful peasant and agrarian movements. So during the Mexican Revolution, you have Emiliano Zapata, this guy over here on the right, and his movement as part of the revolution. It's just one example. In fact, the Mexican Revolution itself is very much agrarian at its heart, right? So you have peasants and landless workers, smallholders, who are actively resisting enclosure and consolidation. And these ideas of what we would now probably call like food sovereignty or peasant sovereignty, the rights of smallholders, they are being articulated from pretty early on. So I mean, Emiliano Zapata's, motto, Tierra y Libertad, is a good example, right? Land and liberty. And this is a through line that'll continue up to the present. So that political component, I think, probably comes out of the indigenous experience of the fact that before the Spanish, while you do have empires and you have some powerful city-states, most peasant peoples have a degree of autonomy that was just unheard of back in Europe by this time. And so expectations of land ownership and of control over your own production, like those are there even before the Spanish, and they continue on into the modern world. So we'll just leave it there. This is obviously a much bigger story, but I think hopefully you kind of get the gist of it. All right. So a lot of things happened between the time of the Spanish conquest and the emergence of industrial agriculture in the late 19th and early 20th century. You get this back and forth of big landowners consolidating control, of peasant movements and revolutionary movements kind of clawing it back. Generally, the trend is toward consolidation, at least until the 1940s. Big landowners tend to get bigger and bigger. It's similar to what we see in the United States and elsewhere. The kind of coming of industrial agriculture to Latin America is going to, at least at first, accelerate this process. We won't go into obviously the whole history of industrial agriculture. We might do this another time to really dive into it. But long story short, World War I is the big turning point, right? So Starting in World War I and then immediately afterwards, we really see big scale industrial processes be introduced into agriculture. So we get new forms of fertilizer that really follow directly on military technologies from the First World War. We see fossil fuel infrastructure just explode during and after the war. So um, agriculture was already moving towards mechanization, even in the 19th century. In the early 20th, this is going to become just more and more dominant, right? Just as technology improves and as the larger industrial infrastructure expands and becomes stronger. In Latin America, the first half of the 20th century, you get some of this. It's a kind of intermittent process. And there is pushback. So you do get on again, off again land reform in the early 20th century. A lot of big estates are broken up and they're redistributed to smallholders, often in the form of communally held land, ejidos. And this happens in the 1930s and 40s. There's also some like takebacks on the part of the state, but in general, there is some pushback on land consolidation. Industrial agriculture really takes off in Latin America after World War II. And it does this in a bunch of different ways. But a lot of it comes from the United States in the form of government action, of private actors like the Rockefeller Foundation, who took these photographs, um, and in trade agreements. There's all kinds of things happening, and just the larger post-war world, where just all of this is happening all over the place. But in general, we see what's often called the Green Revolution in Mexico and elsewhere. Several things happening all at once. One is the introduction at a large scale of artificial fertilizer and pesticides, along with new forms of plant varieties. So new and improved seeds that are being developed by agronomists back in the United States primarily. And actually, you can see here, we have the American agronomists who've come down and they're, instructing the Mexican campesinos kind of what to do and how to get these yields. And I mean, it is true that the North Americans, had developed some, pretty incredible crop varieties that, however, are dependent on these large scale inputs. And of course, this is the thing about industrial agriculture, right? I think we're probably all pretty familiar with this, that to make it successful, it has to be done at a large scale. It relies on big, big inputs, and not just at one time, but basically forever, right? Like you can't stop. And so, of course, this is going to lead to the same kinds of dynamics that we see here in the United States. As farmers adopt these things in Latin America, it leads to land consolidation, often encouraged by the government. That, in Mexico famously is sometimes revolutionary and sometimes is not, regardless of their party designation. Um, it leads to just bigger and bigger levels of scale, right? Because if you want to afford this stuff, you kind of have to go big or go home, in the words of one US Secretary of Agriculture. But unlike in the United States, where this process basically, I mean, it really has very few obstacles. We eventually get critics and some people trying to push back on it. In Latin America, you do get pretty meaningful resistance. And this is where the field of agroecology is going to emerge. Um, as individuals, as researchers, as whole institutions, and eventually kind of political movements and community organizations and others realize some of these drawbacks of industrial agriculture. They're going to look at these inputs, at these costs, at the kind of economic relations that these things create. And they're going to say, wait a minute, yeah, maybe we get bigger yields, on some things for some people. But number one, small scale farmers are not getting bigger yields. In fact, sometimes it's quite the opposite. Adopting these practices make your yields go down if you cannot scale them. Um, they're going to realize that a lot of these practices have negative effects ecologically and environmentally. Um, and they're going to see the kind of wider political implications of these things, that industrial scale agriculture leads to land dispossession. It pushes people just off the land entirely because you just don't need as many people. It leads to consolidation, and it's going to shape the political economy in a particular way. So you have this recognition. At the same time, you still have a lot of these systems of traditional agriculture and of ways of relating to the land and kind of political economy that, they're not as strong as they once were, but they're still there. And so what you really get are agronomists like Efraím Hernández Solo Kotzi, but didn't butcher his name too much, who's trained as a kind of standard agronomist in the United States, who comes back to Mexico and begins working with the campesinos down in the South, ostensibly to train them in these new methods of agriculture. But he realizes that these people actually know what they're doing, right? Like they have limitations, but many of these limitations are very much of a kind of a political nature, right? In terms of how much land they can access. And he realizes that, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's true, they have as much to teach him as he has to teach them. And so you start to get agronomists like these guys and others who are trained in modern science, but who are very attentive to these traditional forms of knowledge in agriculture, and who have an increasingly explicit political perspective. They want to help maintain small scale farming and agrarian communities. They don't want to see them replaced by large scale industrial agriculture. And so they begin to articulate these new ways of thinking about agriculture and about these larger systems. And it not just recovering traditional knowledge, but if you will, expanding it and making it more robust and more productive by using modern science. So let me go back to this one first. And this modern science includes kind of traditional agronomy, but it increasingly, as we go through the 20th century, includes ecology, which is a kind of an emerging field, other scientific disciplines, and then also things like sociology, history, even archaeology. So all of these different disciplines are kind of drawn together while paying attention to and actively listening to what actual farmers and traditional kind of knowledge workers in these environments knew, right? And that they had preserved or kind of maintained over the centuries. And so the work of agroecology kind of going forward from the 1980s up to the present has been to kind of synthesize all of these things and to actually realize them in the real world. We'll go in future sessions, and I'll hopefully get some people who can like speak to this more directly to talk to us. But there have been real successes in Mexico and other parts of Latin America in making agroecology work both practically and politically. Coffee is one good example. So a lot of the coffee produced in Mexico today is done using agroecological principles on pretty small farms. So like 5 hectares or acres or smaller. We have this lady, Lady Petch, I believe Yucatan, is a beekeeper who had an incredible amount of success in fighting against Monsanto, which is not something that happens very often in forging a movement there, specifically oriented around bees and honey production. And there are others that we could list. Now, I mean, it's not unmitigated success, obviously. It's still very much an uphill battle in Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America as much as elsewhere. But, and this is different from the United States, small scale agriculture and more sustainable agriculture has not just survived in Mexico and other parts of Latin America, but it is genuinely viable. And you can look at it and imagine an even more viable future. Whether that will happen or not, of course, is an open question. But there are the kind of systems in place to sustain this work. There are not just people, but there's also kind of institutional backing to some extent. There are popular organizations, and ideas of agroecology have been integrated into other movements and even political parties, things that we'll look at in future sessions. So that potential is there. And I think the reason that it's there goes back to this history of these foundations that were laid and that people have been able to build upon in more recent decades and moving into the future. So I think now for us here in the United States, it's a question of looking at what people are doing, uh, learning from them and figuring out how can we do these things here. What does agroecology look like for us in the United States, in the kind of core of the industrialized world? And how can we learn from these examples and histories and presents and actively build things here in the United States?